What is critical to understand about our development, economic development trajectory during the last 100 years is to understand the nature of the dominant political philosophies and the dominant political groups in South Africa. South Africa, unlike other African countries, we have two types of nationalism. So during the last 100 years, South Africa has been dominated by nationalists of one description or another description. We have these two nationalisms in South Africa. One is Afrikaner nationalism, and the other one is African nationalism. So broadly, Afrikaner nationalism ruled, or Afrikaner nationalists ruled South Africa from the time of independence from the British in 1910 to 1994, when the African nationalists took over, which we associate with the ANC, and the other one is the National Party. So for the last 100 years, we have been dominated, our politics have been dominated by nationalism. Now, what distinguishes the two nationalisms is not that one is black and white, and the other one is white. Many people think that's what distinguishes Afrikaner nationalism from African nationalism. We even think the other one cannot spell it. It spells African with a K. But what actually distinguishes Afrikaner nationalism from African nationalism is that Afrikaner nationalism is the nationalism of property owners, of owners of productive assets. And the primary productive asset of Afrikaner nationalism was land, which they conquered from the indigenous tribes over a 300-year-long period from the Western Cape, spreading from the Western Cape around 1680, right through the last conquest by this group of land was the defeat of the Venda Kingdom in 1899, just before the outbreak of the Anglo War. So that's how they acquired not just the land, they acquired the cattle, which were key, of course, in the South African environment, and most importantly, they also acquired the labor. So the people who they conquered the land from, they became their labor, and they were the primary agriculturalists on behalf of the landowners. So they were called sharecroppers. And these were the people during the colonial era who were the workers, if you wish, on the land of the Afrikaner landowners. They had a very undeveloped agricultural system, but they did own the land nonetheless. So when they captured the state, their primary objective was then to use the state to make their asset more productive and, most importantly, more profitable for them. So if you look at what Afrikaner nationalists did when they took over the state, for example, the first economic law that the Afrikaner nationalists passed when they took over South Africa in 1910 was to set up the land bank. The reason they needed the land bank was because they needed finance to channel taxes into financing the commercial farmer to grow his or her farm. So this was one of the first laws that they promulgated. Another one of the laws was to sort out the labor situation, which of course was the 1913 Native Land Act, which sorted out the issue of sharecropping and labor for the farmer, who was the backbone of Afrikaner nationalism. They did many other things, of course, beyond that. They set up the universities like the University of Pretoria, which became a backbone of the veterinary side of agriculture in South Africa. They developed other schools for the training of their own children in agriculture. on top of that, they had to expand the infrastructure of South Africa in order to bring the maize to the cities, to the metropolitan areas. As you know, the main agricultural region, the main staple for the population, the majority of the people of South Africa, is maize in its various manifestations, mainly as maize flour or milli meal as we call it. But it has grown over a huge stretch of land. South Africa is a rain-short country, it's a low rainfall country, so we only produce one crop of maize a year because we have low rainfall and we also have a cold winter. So unlike countries like Zambia, Ghana and others which can produce 2 or 3 crops of maize, in South Africa we can only produce one crop of maize. So maize has grown over huge vast stretches of land in order to satisfy the needs of especially of the urban population. In order to move this maize and the cattle and all the other agricultural product, the Afrikaner nationalists then had to build the enormous transportation and communication infrastructure that South Africa has today. So what Afrikaner nationalism did, and in order to make itself profitable, to make their properties profitable, it developed a form of cheap labor that I think we are all familiar with. First, it disenfranchised the black population, and then it set up this massive structure of cheap labor that they used as a basis for making their assets profitable. So that was Afrikaner nationalism. But what is therefore striking about Afrikaner nationalism was that it drove a certain type of industrialization of South Africa in order, as I say, to make the nationalists and their constituencies assets more profitable. The other nationalism, which is the African nationalism or black nationalism, is not the nationalism of property owners, but it's the nationalism of professionals. So you can see immediately that one has profit as a big driver, the other, since it doesn't own assets, it has redistribution as the big economic driver of its ideology. So there are two key drivers of African nationalism or black nationalism. One is wealth redistribution, and the other is democratization of the political system. So this is the heritage that we now have from these two nationalisms. From the Afrikaner nationalists, we have a certain level of industrialization of South Africa, a certain level of infrastructure in South Africa, which you don't find in other sub-Saharan African countries other than perhaps Mauritius. So in South Africa, you have this level of infrastructure that was needed by the Afrikaner nationalists, as I say, to make their properties profitable. So that is the heritage we have from that side of our history. From the present side of our history is the democratization of South Africa, which obviously, because the African or black nationalists were disenfranchised, one of their primary agendas was the democratization of the country to enfranchise the group that was disenfranchised. So we have a massive democratic architecture in South Africa, which starts with parliament, with the constitutional court, with the regional parliaments, with the municipal home. So that is, I think, the core heritage of African nationalism. However, there is a weakness, if I can put it like that, of African nationalism is that instead of being production-driven, it is consumption-driven. And the consequence of this consumption-driven core of African nationalism is what we are seeing now is the emerging deindustrialization of South Africa because of lack of investment, because of lack of maintenance of the infrastructure, the transfer of gross domestic product into consumption rather than into investment. The consequence of this is what you see here, which is the steep decline of manufacturing as a percentage of gross domestic product in South Africa. In 1980, 30%, manufacturing was 30% of South Africa's GDP. Today, it's less than 15% of South Africa's gross domestic product. I've also added a graph to illustrate a similar nationalist group, which is the Zimbabwe African Nationalists of ZANU-PF. You see exactly the same trend, whereby instead of investing, you're having a consumption-driven economy, and of course, a steep decline in the manufacturing sector in Zimbabwe. I think if, for example, you compare South Africa GDP to Mauritius GDP, Mauritius, manufacturing in Mauritius as a percentage of GDP is much higher than South Africa and Zimbabwe. And we are independent right now. If you take South Africa household consumption as a percentage of GDP and compare South Africa to the BRIC countries, you see this very, very clearly in this comparison. South Africa